I'm Christopher Lydon, and this is Open Source, looking for our American place in what can feel like a new world order. Steve Walt, you are our first and favorite so-called realist in the foreign policy game. Realists being the people who steer by the interests of nations, not their egos or their dreams. And they look beyond the headlines to the long-term effects of policy, to the results. By your standards, it looks like a new world since that astonishing shouting match in the White House, Donald Trump telling Ukraine's President Zelensky that the U.S. is out of the war on the border of Russia, that we're bent on repairing our relationship with Vladimir Putin. And you're in the news, Steve Walt, with a commentary and a headline that says, yes, America is Europe's enemy now. Sounds edgy, almost alarming to me. What is the American threat to Europe, Steve Walt?
Well, I think the American threat to Europe is an attempt to fundamentally alter a lot of the values and institutions that have been operating in Europe now for 50, 60, 70 plus years. It's not just a case of the United States saying, look, it's been a great relationship, but we need to redefine it. We need a different division of labor with Europe. We need Europe to take responsibility for its own security while we focus on other problems. But we want to do that in a relatively collaborative way, maintain the economic relationship, and remain consistent with a set of liberal values, working with NATO, but in a different role, working with the European Union. That would be one way. You could maybe call it an amicable divorce or just redefining the terms of the relationship. But I think what the Trump administration is doing is much more fundamental than that. And one way to think of it is trying to magnify Europe. Donald Trump is very comfortable with authoritarian rulers, with illiberal Democrats like Viktor Orban in Hungary. He's always expressed animus towards the European Union. I think he said at one point that it was created to hurt the United States, which is simply not true. And I think, therefore, the Trump administration is actively hostile to most of our European allies, would like the European Union to break up so we can deal one-on-one with all the different countries in Europe, and hopefully encourage the far right in Europe to turn Europe into something that looks more like a magnified America. And I think most Europeans would find that as threatening, not a threat of invasion, but a threat of political change encouraged and pushed by Washington.
Steve Walt, I want to put out my own suspicion here that there's a deep connection with ending the war in Ukraine. And part of the emotional atmosphere is a certain embarrassment in the United States and in Europe that we've stuck with that proxy war so long and didn't see the folly of it until Donald Trump, of all people, brought it to an end. He had said that he could have prevented that war and that he would end it quickly, which he pretty well has done. How much of that is playing on this sense that we're not what we were?
I don't think Americans are feeling a sense of embarrassment about Ukraine. Perhaps they should be. The first point to make is the war is not over, right? People are continuing to die on a daily basis in Ukraine. And I think certainly Trump has signaled that American policy is going to be fundamentally different, that the United States is not going to be backing Ukraine, certainly not to the extent that we have, probably not at all. He has said more recently that he's also going to put pressure on Putin if he doesn't come to terms, but we don't have a deal yet. We don't have an end to the war. And I think if the United States leaves, the war is not likely to end soon because Europeans are going to try to do what they can to keep Ukraine in the game as long as they can. There's no question that this war, I think, was both an avoidable war and one that could have been ended much sooner. And in that case, many American presidents have their fingerprints on this as well. The real issue, of course, is how we try to end it and whether or not the approach that Trump is taking is likely to produce that outcome. And we don't know that yet.
I would say that we're feeling the setback of our overreaching in Ukraine, an embarrassment that Zelensky did not start it. The American CIA started it. We were bent on regime change from the beginning there for a long time. The famous Victoria Nuland had been working at it since the early years of this century. And we got our fingers burned again for that overreaching. Can we detach those emotions from this sort of chagrin we're feeling?
Well, we should certainly try. And I agree that basically this has been a catastrophic strategic failure, failure primarily of American diplomacy and statecraft, really now going back 30 or so years. As you know, I think your listeners have heard others recount when the United States began expanding NATO eastward. Many voices said this was a mistake that was ultimately going to lead to a collision with Russia, particularly if the process didn't stop eventually. And that has unfortunately proven to be the case. That was a set of warnings that then got repeated in 2008 when the United States, over the objections of its European allies, insisted that Ukraine and Georgia be invited to apply for NATO membership. Their joining anytime soon wasn't a realistic possibility, but to even do that was waving a red flag in front of Russia. And I think what's clear now, in ways that most people did not appreciate, is that Russia wanted a security order in Europe that was
Right.
not based on the United States unilaterally deciding what that order was going to be, one based primarily on extending NATO as far eastward as possible with the statement that it was open-ended. And Russia had said all along that it wasn't that they wanted to conquer all of Europe, they simply wanted a set of security arrangements in Europe that didn't threaten them, that they felt reasonably comfortable with as well. That didn't necessarily exclude the United States. It didn't mean that NATO had to come apart. Russians might have hoped for that, but that didn't necessarily have to be something we had to agree with. But the point is, we never took that seriously. We never really tried to negotiate anything serious about that. And then when we began moving Ukraine into the Western orbit, again, not necessarily into NATO, but doing a series of things to build up its military capabilities, to promote security cooperation in a whole variety of forms with Europe. And that began to look to Russia like an existential threat to their security. We didn't take their warnings seriously before the war. We didn't do enough to try and bring the war to an end in the first year, where I think there were possibilities as well. And we underestimated throughout how seriously Russia took this issue. Again, that doesn't mean we have to agree. We don't have to think they're right or morally justified in all of that. But we underestimated how seriously they took it, and therefore the sacrifices they would be willing to make. And we overestimated our ability to force them to stop. And that has brought us to the situation we're in now, where Ukraine has been badly damaged and is going to have to accept terms that are probably worse than they might have gotten otherwise, including, of course, avoiding the war entirely.
But just to note that not every American missed the boat on that policy. I mean, the great wise men going back to George Kennan on our relationship with Russia, including Jack Matlock, who had been the U.S. ambassador. Also, William Burns, now the head of the CIA, who had been ambassador to Russia, said this is folly to do that. I'm just seeing all of this in the context of a more cautious America, a more realistic America, still kind of swallowing what was a defeat for the foreign policy establishment.
Yeah, I think that's right. That for the last 35 years or so, the United States has been heavily shaped by a worldview in which the United States was going to spread its values as far as it possibly could, peacefully if possible, but if necessary, backed up with military force. Most visibly, of course, we tried to do that in the Middle East, and that was a complete failure. And then here, I think in Ukraine, we find the final place where it has come to rest in Europe as well. And as someone who likes those liberal values, I'd love to see them be universally shared. But the fact is, trying to spread them sometimes goes up against the interests of others. And sometimes those other states are powerful enough to do something about it. And unfortunately, that's what's happened in Ukraine. And Ukrainians, more than anyone else, have suffered for that.
So what's the risk, Steve Walt, in Europe and ourselves getting used to a humbler American profile in the world?
A humbler profile would be perfectly reasonable. I mean, I think there are concerns. One concern that has been obvious in the last week or two is countries that have been accustomed to counting on American support and American help, if not entirely American protection, are going to have to start thinking about ways of protecting themselves. And one of the ways they might do that is, of course, by considering getting nuclear weapons. That's something the Americans have tried to discourage. We've managed to, I think, limit proliferation in a variety of ways. But if you are feeling exposed, if you're worried, if you're next door to a well-armed nuclear power, as some European countries are, you'll at least think about that possibility as well. And we may find that uncomfortable as well. I think the manner in which we are liquidating the commitment to Ukraine does matter as well. It's not just that the United States wants to push for a peace deal now and wants to put pressure on Ukraine to make that deal. If you do it in a particularly sort of vengeful or unseemly way, as I think the
Yep.
Trump administration has done, that is going to make others see the United States as somewhat less than admirable. So, demanding that Ukraine give us $500 billion of minerals makes the United States look rapacious. Saying that Zelensky caused the war just makes us look like we're making things up as well. And I think the impact on traditional American friends is going to be severe. Again, it's not a question of sitting down with our longtime partners and working out different arrangements, or even sitting down with them saying, look, we need to bring Ukraine and Russia and everyone to a peace deal. This looks much more like we're just cutting and running, and it's not that we're embarrassed about what we've done. We're not even acknowledging that we did anything wrong. We're just leaving. And finally, I think the biggest problem the Trump administration is showing here is just impatience, right? That they want to get this deal done right away. And when you're impatient, you tend not to get the best deal you could. It seems to me a much better approach for Trump, if he wants a peace arrangement that isn't embarrassing and that holds, is one that puts pressure on both sides to come to terms, makes it clear to Russia that they're not necessarily going to get everything they want. They can get much of what they want, but also tries to create a deal that leaves Ukraine with some semblance of security as well, and gives both sides real incentives to stick to the deal after it's been made. It seems to me that would be an act of responsible statecraft, not an act of just saying, oh, well, this is too hard. We're going to go home now.
Steve Walt, it seems everything about the Trump manner is unseemly and rude. At the same time, blaming Zelensky seemed entirely inappropriate, but it was only because he didn't want to say, my own government brought this bad war about, a war that we have all lost together. What if he had said, was there a way to say, Mr. Zelensky, it's been a terrible experience for you, and a lot of it began in our own meddlesome CIA, our habit of regime change. It was substantially our mistake, more ours than yours. You were ready to forswear NATO and declare Ukraine neutral before we were. We got you into this trouble, and now we're going to help get you out.
That would be a perfectly candid conversation to have with Zelensky in private. And if you're going to do that kind of hard bargaining and really put pressure, you do that behind closed doors. Moreover, if you really are feeling a sense of remorse about how your predecessors have mishandled things, then you want to try to be as generous as possible in extracting yourself from that commitment and in helping Zelensky and the Ukrainians get the best deal that they possibly can. So it's one thing to say, my predecessors really screwed you, and now I'm going to screw you a little bit more. And it seems to me that's what Trump did. Also, Trump's never been bashful at all about blaming his predecessors for any number of problems. So he could easily have come out and said, look, my predecessors screwed this one up. I'm going to fix it. In order to fix it, we're going to have to do the following things. We're going to have to make a couple of commitments, but let me make it clear, we're getting this war over. And, that's not what he did there. I think there he was posturing for a domestic audience that likes to see him be strong, likes to see him push other leaders around, but it was not effective diplomacy. And by the way, it seems to have backfired in the sense that it's made Zelensky more popular back in Ukraine for standing up to Trump. If you're trying to get Zelensky to cut a deal and compromise, that was not necessarily what you wanted to do. Gets back to my point about being impatient is sometimes a real handicap when you're trying to conduct diplomacy.
Steve, it was almost held against Donald Trump and J.D. Vance during the campaign that they were suspected of being realists, of seeing the mistake in Ukraine as it was happening. What is the realist piece of Donald Trump's modus operandi, if any?
I think the realist part here, and I've sometimes referred to it as sort of Neanderthal realism, is, he sees a world in which there are winners and losers, where there are strong and weak, where, to quote the old Thucydides line, the strong do what they can, the weak
Right.
suffer what they must, and that the United States should be out for itself. That foreign policy is not a philanthropic activity. It's all about advancing the U.S. national interest. And the problem with that view, I mean, I have some sympathy to that general perspective that, presidents are elected in order to help make the country safer and more prosperous, et cetera. But the problem with Trump's Neanderthal version of realism is it forgets that other actors have agency, and that if you start getting a reputation for being unreliable, vengeful, rapacious,
Right.
the rest of the world starts distancing itself and eventually starts joining forces to try and keep you in check. Moreover, Trump seems to think that being unpredictable is good. It keeps everyone off balance. No one knows what he's likely to do next.
The madman theory, the old Nixon trope.
Partly the madman theory, but the madman theory doesn't work on a daily basis. Among other things, it means that other states have to start hedging. All right, they don't want to adjust their behavior in the expectation that the United States will do X, Y, or Z and continue to do it, because it's too mercurial. The United States might change next week, so we better make other arrangements that are not dependent on anything the United States might promise. And you see this, of course, in the way Trump's been handling the tariff issue.
Right.
One day he threatens them, the next day he takes them off. And of course, other countries begin to say, well, who needs this? We'll just make other arrangements. The business community starts to react because they can't plan. And then last time I looked, the Dow was down 850 points today. So I think we're seeing the consequences of all of this. And
Yep.
finally, it assumes that other states will not, as I said before, start looking for ways to keep the United States in check. Instead of being able to count on the support of other countries that have been our partners for a long time, we're going to ask for that support and we're not going to get it. So, for example, when the Biden administration went to the Dutch and said, look, we'd like some of your companies not to sell these advanced lithographic machines that are used for making highly sophisticated computer chips. We don't want you to sell those to China because we're trying to slow down China's technological development, some key areas. The Dutch went along with that because they were our allies, even though it cost them money. They were going to lose sales that they would otherwise have made. I think you wake up 2 or 3 years from now and you'll discover that countries like Holland are much less willing to go along with what we might request. Certainly that'll be true of Canada, almost certainly true of Mexico as well. And from a realist point of view, from the point of view of wanting to maximize the amount of support you can get from others and minimize the amount of opposition you face, this is a real mistake.
So many things are coming into focus together, including now the stock market. But I would have said that the insult to Europe, if that's what it is the least of our problems. What is the actual risk for anybody in Europe from Donald Trump's disregard or neglect or maybe ignorance?
Well, I think, for example, he's trying to promote extremists in Europe. This was, J.D. Vance going and
Yep.
meeting with the head of the Alternative for Deutschland party, not meeting with the German chancellor, meeting with the far-right extremist party there. I saw earlier today that there's now some people in the sort of Trumpist movement and some, I guess, Hungarians now proposing that the European Union change its name to like the European Community of Nations. And again, this idea that we don't want a unified Europe, that we want Europe divided up in lots of different ways. A Europe that has been committed to a set of institutions that have helped keep the peace in Europe for, more than half a century. A Europe that likes a set of liberal democratic values, likes the rule of law, things like that. They would regard the support that Trump is giving to far-right movements in Europe with, I think, some considerable alarm. So no, they don't have to worry that the United States is going to invade Europe. But notice the United States under Donald Trump has said we might use military force to take Greenland.
Right.
So step back and say, when was the last time the United States was openly saying, look, we're just going to conquer it and take it? This is, I think, not the kind of principled position the United States has tried to support however inconsistently, for many years, and which has served us very well. Of course, once we start heading down that road, once the most powerful country in the world starts basically acting as though there are no rules, this is
Right.
going to force Europe and everybody else to go and adopt similar rules themselves, similar way of behaving. Not that they're going to try to conquer Greenland, take it back from us as well, but they will start operating in much the same way. And I think that's very short-sighted. And I say that as a realist, that in a world that is always inclined to competition and conflict, you want to do what you can to minimize that danger and to keep as many parts of the world as quiet as possible. And I fear that is not what Donald Trump is trying to do.
And we won't even mention the Riviera on the Eastern Mediterranean, heretofore known as Gaza. Sum it up, though, in terms of the risk to us, Steve Walt, including a fundamentally changed relationship with Putin's Russia.
So I think Trump does have a view of how he wants to operate, which is that basically this is a world where he's very comfortable operating with other autocratic leaders. That's who he gets along well with. That's who he tends to admire and envy. He likes the Putins. He likes the Xi Jinpings. He likes Kim Jong-un. He likes Mohammed bin Salman. Those are the people that he would like to, I think, govern like. And this assumes that then the United States can form good relations with all of these countries. I think he also recognizes that China is a potential rival and would like to pull Russia away from China. I don't think that will succeed while he's president. But the danger is that the United States ends up in what I called in a recent column a sort of concert of kingpins, right? A bunch of autocratic leaders. The problem with doing that is these are all like a bunch of mafia bosses.
Right.
None of them can trust each other, right? And they don't have a significant set of shared values. They're all going to be eyeing each other rather warily. And in the meantime, the United States has turned its back on countries that have traditionally been like us for the last 50 or 70 years, and where the United States has had very good and close relationships. So I think, again, we're entering a world where suddenly the United States can no longer count on the support of countries we've traditionally been able to get help from. And all of those countries are going to have to start recalculating their positions in a variety of ways. So if we're worried about a rising China, in order to deal with China and be able to balance it in Asia, we need cooperation from a lot of countries in Asia. And they will look at the United States and see us as a country that you can't count on, because ultimately it's all up to the whims of one person. If that person decides he doesn't like you and wants to cut a deal with Beijing or wants to cut a deal with North Korea, that's what's going to happen. So you can't count on the United States anymore. And that means you have to start hedging and operating on your own. And I think that is a much less predictable, much more competitive world, and not one in which America is going to be either safer or more prosperous.
Steve, I'm just struck that we ought to be talking about these foreign policy issues a lot more. We've never really debated the Ukraine war in this country until Donald Trump tells us that it's over. But let's keep doing it. You're always helpful to us. Thank you.
Nice talking with you.
Stephen Walt is the Belfer Professor of International Relations at Harvard. You can read his latest column called What I Got Wrong About Trump's Second Term in Foreign Policy magazine online. Here at Open Source, we rely on listener support. So now's the time, if you haven't done your part yet, please go to radioopensource.org/donate and pitch in to keep the world's first and longest running podcast going strong. Open Source is proud to be a member of Hub and Spoke, a Boston-based collective of independent, creator-owned podcasts. Our shows range from history to technology to politics to art. We come together around the principle that independent voices are more important than ever. You can learn more at hubspokeaudio.org. Thank you.